What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. A long while ago, I looked at the possible Pokemon type matchups that could be a stand-in for the starter trio. You might have seen it. And while there were more candidates than you would expect, they were separated a bit by how perfectly they aligned, with some of the trios not fully resisting each other in the way that the starters really should. But recently I got to wondering, if those triangles did become an official group of starters, where would they be able to work best? Which games would best support these unique setups for new starters, and what Pokemon would they have to use instead of the typical 3-stage lines that we see? So we'll start from the least consistent triangles and work our way up to the ones that are most similar to the good old fire, water, grass that we're used to. But we'll have to start with ice because we know that it doesn't resist anything besides itself. However, it can create a trio of super effective coverage with ground and fire. It makes for an interesting setup for sure, with multiple inspirations, but ice and ground can also be in a triad with rock or steel, swapping out for the fire. Those ones may not be as thematically satisfying, however ground does not actually resist fire or steel, despite hitting them super effectively, so I guess we'll have to say rock for this one since ice already adds nothing defensively. So where could a starter like that be used? Well, why not Galar? In this region, you could create a starter trio with Sandile, Vanillite, and Roly-Coly. Ideally, you could get a pure ground line, but surprisingly, there actually are no pure 3-stage ground Pokemon, so we need to fix that immediately, but the extra dark wouldn't hinder any of the relationships. However, I picked Roly-Coly specifically so that we could use both rock and fire in this setup, so that we don't actually have to pick between the two. And it still works like the traditional starters, mostly in the early game before the fire type is attached, where Milo and Nessa would beat 2 of them easily, but then Kabu would handily beat the ice. They would all just take turns having a hard time throughout the game. Of course, the other two would have to get their own Gigantamax forms to match, but the original Gen 8 starters didn't get them until the DLC anyway, but of course that's not really going to help Vanillux actually be good in battle. Now, Ice could be in another relationship with Grass and Rock, however the Ice could also be replaced by either Bug or Flying, who are all weak to Rock but can also all beat Grass. So instead of Ice, I would offer up Bug and Flying instead, since there are quite a few of those out there, which would lead me to recommend the Hisui region where you could use Roserade, Rhyperior, and Beautifly. Obviously, you would have to bump up Beautifly's stats to be on par with the others, but they have done that for partner Pokemon like in Let's Go, so it could happen again. Also, Rhyhorn evolves at a super high level, so we would have to utilize the same level-changing tactics that Legends Arceus already used. And the poison on Roserade doesn't really interfere all that much. It does make Rhyperior's ground hit neutrally, but the Drill Pokemon is quad weak to grass anyway, so I think it's alright. Hisui is also a good spot for this because they've got vastly different checkpoints that each of the new starters would be hurting against, but ones that they could beat no problem as well. So I think they could embody the relationships of these 3 specific Pokemon in a satisfying manner. Although Rhyperior may feel left out as it's not a pretty Pokemon like the others, but it still fits within the trio. I actually really love the triangle with Electric being paired with Water and Ground, but they can't go much further because while you can see a clear through line of effectiveness, Electric does not actually resist Water, and Water does not resist Ground. However, the trio works pretty well, even more so in the Hoenn region, where we can use Azumarill, Magnezone, and Flygon. Obviously, that would have to be in the remake so that Magneton could actually evolve here, but that also works in favor of Azumarill gaining the Fairy type. This plays into the typings of the other two, since the Water Pokemon could still take out the Ground just on the Dragon side instead, and Magnezone would still be able to resist that extra Dragon typing with the Steel, and in turn, that Steel would resist the Fairy on the Aqua Rabbit. So there's no unfair coverage to circumvent the triangle. This trio also interacts with Hoenn in a fun way, where there are multiple trainers that have clear advantages over some of the starters where the others would be fine. And even the dual evil teams are fun, with Team Magma destroying Magnezone, but it would shine against Team Aqua and vice versa with the others. Although I guess that would change up that famously difficult rival battle before Mauville, but it would still be fun to try out Hoenn with these super cool Pokemon as the mascots. Okay, the start of the middle tier for starter trios is the Fighting Fairy Steel setup. And while pretty decent thematically, it can't go much higher because fighting doesn't actually resist steel like everyone expects, so it's not perfect but still overall good, especially when you can go to the Kalos region and use Florges, Aggron, and Machamp. Kalos introduced the fairy type, so a starter to showcase its type matchups would have been perfect. Now, there are different methods of evolution for these Pokémon, but we've seen changes before when needed, so we could cut trainers a break, not forcing them into trading anything. The rock type on Aggron doesn't change anything other than making Machamp more of a threat, but it also loses rock when it Mega Evolves. Oh yeah, I guess the others would need new Megas too, but that shouldn't be too big of a problem, honestly. Granted, a Steel type would probably be pretty unbalanced in the early game, but at least there is a Fighting type gym to put them in their place early on. Actually, all of those types have a specialist in the Kalos region, so each of the starters could have their time in the sun. But now we move on to the even more balanced options. See, these type triangles actually have the proper resistances in place to better replicate the current sanctioned starter makeup. Like with Fire, Rock, and Steel. You probably don't think of this trio first thing, but Rock does beat Fire, which in turn can best Steel, who then goes on to beat Rock. And in the other direction, they conveniently all resist each other as well. It's just maybe not that fun to think about because Rock and Steel seem to occupy a similar space, being tough, physically strong defenses, but I think that they could work in Unova with a Chandelure, Gigalith, and Klinklang. Largely monotyped here, but the ghost on the Candelabra doesn't impede anything else, unless you count the normal type gyms early in the region, but that might actually be more fair since the other two already resist normal as it is. So maybe they would change that to a different gym altogether if they went with this trio. And while N and Team Plasma don't have a particular emphasis, there are certain specialists that each starter could take turns dominating. Even if Gigalith and Klinklang's stats are a bit too similar looking for my taste, I wish they were a bit more distinctly invested. One that's pretty surprising is the trio of Flying, Fighting, and Rock. Because you don't usually get to see Flying by itself, you don't think about how they're all super effective and resist each other. And even though Rookidee is the only pure Flying base stage that we have, we can't keep Corviknight in the mix because Steel would definitely change things too much. So instead, we'll go over to Alola with Crobat, Machamp, and Gigalith. Now, I know that we've already used two of those Pokemon before now, but they would never change all of these Pokemon at once, so we'll just play along like each of them is the first instance of altering the starter triangles altogether, and we can always throw in a link cable for the trait evolutions too. Now, that being said, Crobat is required because if we went with something like Toucanon, the normal would make fighting neutral instead of resisted, so the poison on the bat actually increases that resistance. But it is also resisted by Rock, so the flying entry doesn't have any undue advantage. And it would be simple enough to give them all a signature Z move, I guess. But I like this relationship a lot, where one basically embodies offense, another is pure defense, and the last is speed, so that you get to pick the way that you like to play best. Possibly the most famous alternate type triangle is Dark, Psychic, and Fighting. It's like the original starter trio, but it has absolutely no overlap with the standard grouping, so it can be popular to see them slapped onto other starters, but as clean as this setup is, I'm not as fond of it because Dark is completely immune to Psychic instead of only resisting it. But other than that unfairness, these three work out pretty great. So if they were to make these types starters, outside of the Kalos region that is, I think it would probably be in Paldea with Hatterene, Kingambit, and Conkeldurr. Ordinarily, Steel interferes with the other types, but Dark was weak to fighting anyway, and that quad weakness could counteract the imbalance of the immunity on the other side. Plus that Steel Edge helps to neutralize the Fairy typing on Hatterene that would otherwise dominate the Dark, and since Psychic is already supposed to beat fighting, the super effective Fairy is just a nice bonus. Once again, these Pokemon all have different methods of evolution, but we could unify that, or I guess we could make it more complicated for Hatterene to match the effort on the others if we really wanted to make it harder on purpose. So sadly, this group is not as thematically cohesive. Conkeldurr doesn't even have a signature move like the other ones, but I actually like how they're mostly neutral to the gyms, especially early on. But they do get more specialized with a chance to shine against the team star bases and some of the later trainers. I guess the only major downside is that Conkeldurr doesn't have a dual typing to match the others. However, my undisputed favorite triangle that could replace the starters is that of grass, ground, and poison. I really love the idea of poison harmlessly diffusing into the ground, only to have the grass overgrow the ground, but the poison comes in to kill the grass. It's a very believable circle that also has all of the types resisting each other in the opposite way. The main problem here is that a lot of the grass types with a third stage end up being poison too, which throws off the whole relationship. So that's why I've decided to go with Jumpluff, Golem, and Gengar in the Johto region. Once again, this lets each of the Pokemon fill a niche, one of them as a wall, one of them for strong special attacks, and another for speedy supportive techniques in addition to their original type triangle. Plus, Johto was before there were even abilities, so you don't have to worry about the Ghastly line levitating above the super effective ground. And on top of that, the ghost doesn't really obstruct the other starters' types in any way. You could argue the flying on Jumpluff might be a little off balance, but it was supposed to resist ground anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Besides, he's got bigger problems like suddenly becoming a trait evolution to match the others. I know more than likely they would change it the other way, but even if the rock typing on Golem technically means that it hits Jumpluff super effectively, the Megaton Pokemon is also quad weak to grass, so I would say it's still relatively balanced. It's just a bit hard to find 3 fully evolved Pokemon lines of these specific types without interferences of some kind between them, so ideally they would create a new trio of starters from scratch to specifically show off the strengths and weaknesses of these respective types in a new region one day. But I think for now, Johto is a good showcase of these Pokemon, since they keep rotating on who is the best and worst to deal with certain challenges all throughout the game. Plus, it gives you a whole extra region to appreciate this type trio at work that's just as valid as the starters that we know and love. And they could even be every bit as marketable too, I assure you. So what's your favorite stand-in for the routine starter type triangle? And where would you like to see it the most? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!